we are 1690. We're crossing 1700, so moving right along. It's good to... It's a good rating right now. I think the games are quite interesting. And we've had really a couple of instructive ones. And we're black here against Andre 69. Well, let's continue our Caro-Kann explorations. I'm liking the kinds of positions we're getting in the Caro-Kann. And he goes e5. Okay, so that is not a move you see every day. This move does exist. I've seen it before, and it's not terrible, but we don't necessarily... Well, we can play d5 here, and then white has the possibility of going d4 and transposing to an advanced Caro. But if you want to make sure that white gets absolutely no advantage out of the opening, you can target this pawn straight away by playing d6 and just trading this pawn off. So d6 is, I think, the simplest possible move. Yeah, so ed6, ed6. Black is not better. This is equal. But white is totally not contending for an advantage. It's a bit of a bummer because it's a completely dry position. But so be it. You got to accept that sometimes. Okay, so d4. We can play d5, or we can play it later. Let's start by developing our knight to f6. Okay, goes c3. But it seems like after d5, we get a symmetrical position where I'm basically playing white, because I've got an extra tempo on him. So it makes sense to go d5, open up a pathway for the bishop to get to d6. And I think a lot of you might benefit from a little tutorial in playing. You know, I always rant about boring positions, but it's important to be able to play them well. Bishop g5. All right. So how should we handle this move? There's many setups that we can choose here. There's no real correct move here. There's a lot of possibilities. But how should we, you know, what are the possibilities? The simplest move is just to play bishop e7 here, as we often like to, in order to remove the pin. And now, if we wanted to play ambitiously, we could now act on the fact that there was no pin and play knight e4. Knight e4 is a very good move in such positions, centralizing the knight, forcing him to resolve the tension. But we could play it later. We could castle first and play knight e4 later. It doesn't particularly matter. We could also play bishop g4, although bishop g4 could be met with bishop e2, and then we get too symmetrical of a position. I want to introduce a little bit of an asymmetry to the position. So let's play knight e4. Let's play it ambitiously. And let's see what he does. Well, if they take and play knight d2, then they run into a discovery. Could bishop f4. Okay, so that's a bit of a surprise to me. I mean, I was expecting him to take on e7, but we don't change our pattern of moves. We just castle. Bishop d3. Okay, and now that he's played bishop d3, you see, we were waiting to develop this bishop because I wanted to see where he put his bishop. That's often a strategy where you're basically posturing for position in this sort of subtle way, where you're trying to get your opponent to show his cards, and then you're figuring out where to put your pieces on the basis of that. Well, not bishop f5. You don't need to defend this knight. The knight is supported by the pawn. You can support it with the other pawn if need be. But now you can play bishop g4, because white would have to waste a tempo dropping the bishop back to e2. And this creates a little bit of tension in white's position. It's not a big deal. We're not better. But, you know, we're beginning to annoy him just a little bit. Because a lot of people don't like to return to e2 and make the same, you know, make two moves with one piece. Although bishop e2 would be, you know, perhaps the most cautious move for white here. Now, on the next move, we need to complete our development. The knight goes to d7 in such positions. And we could imagine that the knight could later go to f6, supporting the e4 knight. Although most likely it's just going to remain on d7 for the time being, just making sure that his knight never gets a chance to reach the e5 square uncontested. Can't they just take with the queen, though? Well, we're not planning to take the knight. We're just putting pressure on his position. What we're essentially doing, we're pinning the knight to the queen, so if the queen ever moves aside, then we'll be able to take the knight and ruin his pawn structure. In such positions, you can't do everything at once. You have to gradually build up the pressure very patiently, you know, inch by degrees. And eventually, if you annoy your opponent enough, or if you create enough small problems, these small problems coalesce into bigger ones. So knight d7, of course. And again, we have in reserve the move f5, which will only really be necessary if he puts more pressure on the knight. And there comes queen b3. There comes the mistake. So he immediately loses his patience. And obviously, the reason we played bishop g4 is so that we could take the knight precisely in this situation. Now, my guess is that he saw this and assumed that we wouldn't be able to take on f3 because now he's attacking b7 and he's attacking the knight simultaneously. Now, for the record, even if we had to sacrifice the pawn on b7, I still would not mind. We still would go for this. It would probably be worth the pawn sacrifice, but we don't have to. And there's many reasons why not. What's the simplest move? Where can we bring the knight so that the pawn on b7 is defended? Okay, so we can play knight d6, and it's very important to establish that if he takes on d6 and then takes on b7, he's left his king completely wide open. And how can we punish, how can we deliver checkmate in the most efficient manner if he does that? Just to make sure that we're on the same page there. Yeah, queen h4 or even queen g5 and queen f4 building up the battery. That's obviously going to result in checkmate, so we just drop our knight back to d6. Now, you don't necessarily have to see that even when you're playing knight d6. You can just see that by taking on d6, he's leaving his king wide open. He's not going to do that. That's not a mistake that people in the 60... Oh, well, I guess it is a mistake that people in the 1600 range could make. I jinxed him. Yeah, that's strange. I mean, he seems to be oblivious to the threat that lies, that's staring at him right in the face. So, all right. So let's find the fastest checkmate. Let's find the fastest checkmate, and it's not queen h4. Queen h4 is the most tempting move, but people often forget that one way of defending against the mate threat is to move the rook aside and open up a little escape pathway for the king, which doesn't, that doesn't save white in the long term. But what you can start with is queen g5 check. You drive the king further into the corner, and then either queen h4 or even better queen f4, creating the battery and leading to imminent checkmate. Queen f4 is the most clinical move. Boom, boom. And queen takes h2, mate. Yeah, this check first is often missed by people. Driving the king into the corner first. And sometimes that contains a lot more importance than it does here. Here, everything wins. Okay. Yeah, well, I just think he didn't see the bigger picture. He didn't recognize how weak his king was. So, yeah, that escalated quickly. Okay, so e5 is not terrible. And I think d6 is probably the best way to respond to it. Takes, takes. Okay, d4, knight f6. Okay, c3 is fine. Yeah, bishop g5 is fine. Yeah, so if I was playing white, I would suggest starting with knight d2 so that we don't have the... Or so that knight e4 isn't as strong. And then playing knight f3 and bishop d3. This is dead equal. Thank you, SNTH. That's a great point, Simon. And same with h3. You're absolutely right. That's literally the fastest mate. Thank you for the 2 gifted. Okay, so this would be a little bit more precise. Knight f3, knight e4. And now I would take on e7. I'm not sure why he tried to be cool and go like bishop f4, because he ended up in a very passive position. Just take on e7, queen e7, bishop e2, still equal. But I would definitely take black here. I mean, it's equal, but black is maybe a tiny bit more comfortable here. So that's one way that we could have rolled out our development. He played bishop f4, and again, we castle. He goes bishop d3, and only now do we develop our bishop to g4. Because if he had developed his bishop to e2, then we probably would have occupied f5. Okay, so it depends where he puts his bishop, and in accordance with that, we choose where to develop ours. If that makes sense. Because bishop g4 after bishop e2 would not be nearly as effective, and it might walk into the exact same thing that we did to him, which is knight e5. That kind of plays into his hands. All right. So bishop d3, bishop g4, castles, knight c7, and things really haven't reached a crisis point here, but he panics with queen b3. Now, what should white do here? Well, the situation, I think, already calls for just dropping the bishop back to e2 and immediately dealing with his pin. Because the more time we have to accumulate the pressure, the worse it becomes for white. If white plays one more nonchalant move, such as rook e1, well, rook e1 might not be so bad. We would meet that with f5, cementing the knight on e4, and, you know, now it's a little bit harder for white to deal with the pressure. h3, we would, whoops, sorry. h3, we would go bishop h5. h3 is not a problem. h3, just bishop h5, and we are fine. I mean, g4 is obviously way too weakening. We can then play f5 and just make his king side explode. Is bishop g5 bad? Where? Well, bishop g5 doesn't really work. We just take the bishop. So, not sure which position you're referring to, but queen b3, we obviously take and go knight to d6. Why is g4 weakening if his black bishop is still up? Well, it's weakening because he advances pawns in front of his own king. And that's weakening regardless of the pieces that he has left. And in addition, it creates a hook on g4. And a hook is a pawn that's advanced past its initial square. And we can use this hook to open up files for our rook. In particular, we could follow this with f5 and try to take on g4 and open up the rook's pathway. And then his pieces are going to get incredibly vulnerable. Also note that when you play the move g4, the knight is no longer protected by a pawn. And that becomes very important when the f file is open. That knight could get caught up in some sort of a fork or a skewer, stuff like that. Would g4 be good if he hasn't castled yet? No. So I guess what you're asking is this a better idea than it is when he's castled? Marginally, because maybe he'll castle queenside. But the problem is that when he plays c3, he weakens his queenside as well. And I don't really see a way for him to efficiently organize queenside castle. So this is way too committal. It burns all the bridges. And even with his king in the center, it's still very weakening. Opening up the f file is still very good for black. So I wouldn't recommend this under any circumstances. In general, playing h3, g4 is something that you do. There are situations when you're castled and when it is acceptable to play h3, g4. But this is not one of them. And there are also situations when your king is in the center, but you know for a fact that you're going to castle the other way. And when you know that, then you can do basically whatever the hell you want on the side that you're not castling on. Now, to give you a very simple example of a position where you would play h3, g4, and then castle, there's a set of subtle differences that that often allow you to play h6 and g5 or h3 and g4 when you're already castled. So let me give you an example. Okay, so this is just a random Italian kind of position. And let's assume that it's white to move. Like in this position, playing h3 followed by g4 would be very much acceptable. And the reason why, first of all, is that if you compare that to the position we were just looking at, this pawn cannot be as easily exploited. In the game position, we had the idea of going f5 to open the f file. Clearly that is not applicable here because there's another pawn on e4 and the knight is in the way. It's just not practical. And the secondary thing is that black's pieces are kind of clogged up, and it's just not as easy to approach white's king in any way. This bishop on g5 is a really nice piece. It's immobilizing the knight. It's creating a pin of white's own. So just from the point of view of trying to get an attack started, it's a lot harder to do that here than it is there. And this pin that the bishop is exerting over the knight is very, very hard to deal with, because after h6, bishop h4, the bishop on g6 is blocking black's ability to go g5, and this bishop cannot drop back to e7 because there's a pawn on d6. So you can see the specific factors in the position dictate whether you're able to get away with something like this. There's no easy answer here. You have to look at each position individually and ask yourself, does my opponent have the capacity to exploit these weaknesses that I'm making? And that can be a hard question to answer. Okay. Well, white can extend on the queen side. White can continue on the king side too. So I can give you an example for one of my games, actually. Let me see if I can find one of my games where I played h3, g4 when I castled, and I'll show you how I was able to. Okay. Actually, no. Nah, this is not a good game. Yeah, let's just go back to that position. I'm not an expert in these Italian positions, so take this with a grain of salt. Basically, one idea would be to expand on the queen side. That's sort of something you could do independent of whatever your plan is. You know, you could try b4, a4, just pressuring black on the queen side, maybe b5. Another idea would be, in very typical Rai Lopez and Italian fashion, to go rook e1 and then follow it up with knight f1, knight e3, or knight g3. Then trying to get the knight to d5 to pressure the f6 knight, or maybe to f5. So that's another idea. And a third idea could be, believe it or not, to actually attack on the king side. So you could try to move your king aside to h1 and go rook g1 and use these pawns and pawn storm g5 and then knight g5. And you have an abundance of pieces on the king side. So just because your king is also on the king side doesn't exclude you from attacking on that side of the board. You're going to have to be very careful to make sure your king doesn't get caught in the crossfire, but you can still very much attack black's king here. And that's something which a lot of people just assume is impossible. If you're castled to the king side, well, then you can't push the pawns on that same side of the board. You absolutely can. You just got to do it with a lot of caution. But just because white's king is a little bit exposed doesn't mean you just automatically can't attack on that side. It looks risky, but where is black's attack going to come from? Black has no pieces that are currently capable of even approaching white's king. White's queen is going to come out to f3. Black's going to get checkmated here pretty straightforwardly. Double rooks on the g-file, exactly. Is h3 without g4 a good idea? Yes. h3 without g4 is usually a good idea, just to create luft, to tickle the bishop, and to be able to play g4 later. f4 against the Caro, you can play d5, e5, bishop f5, just like against the advance. What's the best response to a pawn storm without pieces backing them up? Well, that's a bit of a general question, and it really depends. Sometimes pawn storms create weaknesses that you want to occupy, and sometimes, you know, if a pawn storm weakens your opponent's king, then, you know, you want to exploit the weaknesses that are created. So I can give you an example of an instance where my opponent played h6 g5 on the same side that he castled, and it backfired. He shouldn't have done it, and I can show you how I was able to exploit it if people are interested. And this is slightly off topic, but I think to your question. So this is a game I played in 2011. I was an IM. This is a sort of a typical Rai Lopez, sort of like the position we just saw. Has certain similarities. And here I came up with an interesting idea. I played the move knight a3. So my idea was to get the knight involved to e3, but in a very unconventional way. Usually the way that you do it is you play knight bd2 and then rook e1 and then knight f1, but I found in this particular case a more efficient way to do it. I play knight a3, then knight c2, then knight e3. But so my opponent goes h6, bishop h4, bishop g4. I go knight c2. I mean, I'm still going to e3, and he goes g5. Okay, so bishop g3 and knight to h5, trying to get his own knight perhaps to f4. And what I was able to do here is kind of trick my opponent into exposing his king even further. I played knight e3. Okay, so this attacks the bishop on g4 and forces it to decide. The problem for black is that taking my knight is horrible, because look at these holes on the light squares that have been created. So that's unthinkable, right? Moving the bishop, if I'm calculating it correctly, falls into a very typical tactic in these types of positions. Who can spot the tactic that I'm referring to? And as you're thinking, I'm going to go pour some more tea. Just give me a minute, guys. I have arrived. Yep, knight takes c5 is correct. Loose pieces drop off. But wait a minute. Black can take on g3, and if we take the knight, then we lose the knight. But no, as I'm sure many of you correctly understood, intermediate move, you take the knight, attack the queen. Black has to take, you take, and now white is up a pawn, and black's king side is full of holes, and queen is coming out to h5, and the game is basically over. Okay? So my opponent is kind of stuck, and he's forced to take the knight. And after f takes e3, I've got kind of good doubled pawns that control all these squares. And guess what? I've got the f file for my rook. Now he decided to also take my bishop, and I take back. And now he drops the bishop to e6, which makes sense. I mean, this bishop on b3 is a very strong bishop. It's, you know, it's x-raying the king and stuff, so he decides to trade it. But I don't need to react to this move because my queen is defending my bishop. So in principle, if I had found a good move, I don't necessarily need to trade bishops. In fact, it's a very bad idea to trade bishops because he's going to take back with what? And this is very instructive. So what is he going to take back with? He's going to take back with a pawn. And this is very bad for white because this opens up a line of negotiation between the rooks. And now you're hamstrung because if you move the knight aside to try to get the queen to h5, you allow a trade of rooks, and the more black trades, the less pronounced the weaknesses become. I hope that makes sense. Also, the f5 square, which, hey, guess what? Maybe this knight, this square could be occupied by the knight one day, is no longer a weakness. So that was out of the question. And I started to think, okay, well, clearly in playing h6, g5, black has exposed himself on the light squares. In particular, what two squares seem to be the weakest among all of the light squares on the king side? What are the two squares where the party seems to be at? But his king is more open is a relative thing, right? Yes, technically his king is more open, but again, I come back to this concept. What are you going to exploit that with? You don't have the tools necessary to exploit the fact that the king is more open. Simply the fact that the king is more open is not a reason not to play a move, if that makes sense. h5 and f5 is correct. So I thought, okay, and I love this kind of backward reasoning. I want to occupy both of those squares at some point. Now, which pieces seem poised to occupy those squares? Well, you can already imagine the queen going to h5. And thank you, Stowe Production. And you can imagine perhaps the rook going to f5 after the bishop. If we can get black to trade on our terms, then the rook will come to f5, and then we can double rooks. Now that, first of all, leaves the knight. And when I gave this position to my students, a lot of them suggested the move knight to d2, which is quite a sensible move. And the idea is that after bishop takes b3, you play knight takes b3 so you don't distract the queen. The queen comes to h5 and the rook comes to f5. But my criticism of this is that, well, what about the knight? The knight seems to be stranded on b3 and it wants to join the party. So in what way can we get the knight to join the party? As many of you are suggesting, you can play knight h2, and that is in fact what I played. And it's an inaccuracy, but it's almost correct. So my ideal position arose in the game. So my opponent took on b3, he played queen e6, and now the reason it was an inaccuracy is just because it's a little bit inefficient. Queen back to d1, queen to h5, and if I had found a way to not spend so many tempi on moving my queen back and forth, I would have already been able to put my rook on f5 and put my knight on g4. That was the ideal setup that I was aiming for. Rook on f5, whoops, no, and knight on g4. Now all three pieces are in the party and just massaging black, terrorizing black, I should say, on these light squares, right? But what I had not realized is that I do have a way of accomplishing this plan more efficiently. And the correct move simply slipped my mind. So rather than trading on e6, there's an intermediate square that I could go to. What move am I talking about? It's a really, really powerful positional move, and it shows a deep understanding of the position. Mailman, he's got it. Bishop to d5. Yes, this is the classic application of trading on your own terms. You're basically telling black, either take my bishop, and then not only do you get all of this stuff, but now black's knight has to move back and destroy the connection between the rooks and give white the a file on top of everything else, and you can still go knight h2 and queen h5. But if black doesn't take and moves the knight, then you've washed your hands of the need to babysit the bishop. White could go knight h2, and this bishop is perfectly good on c6. And the funny thing is, if c6, then you can already take the bishop on e6, because since the connection between the rooks has been destroyed. Now white can get away with taking and going queen h5, and black is just totally overwhelmed here as the knight comes to g4. This is a brilliant positional move. I missed it. I played knight h2, which is the next best thing, but you can kind of see the logic building up on top of each other. Like, first we find where our pieces belong. We understand that we want to use the light squares. We come up with a target setup, and then that final step is figuring out the most efficient way of bringing that setup about. So there's a lot of steps here, but you know, if you can go through all of those steps, you're able to produce nice moves. All right, and I managed to win the game. I ultimately outplayed him. I mean, I attacked him from all sides. I won a pawn, and then ultimately I won this endgame. All right, I'm glad to hear people enjoyed that. But let's move to the next game. So back to the speedrun game. Nothing worthwhile happened after queen b3. I'm going to explain this after the game, during the game. Yeah, he took on d6. That loses immediately. White should just develop the knight to d2, and white is still very much alive. The bishop could drop back to g3 to lend some support to the king. But taking on d6 is just very short-sighted. And yeah, this wins the game. And yes, as Simon indicated, this is less efficient technically because white can prolong the game by one more move. So queen f4 is not only more clinical, but literally more efficient.